So I'm going to talk about migration and well-being today, although I'm afraid there isn't really a paper. So it's more sort of stream of consciousness. But do please feel free to ask any question or give any thoughts. So basically, I'll start with what I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about the impact of migration on the well-being of migrants. I think there's quite a lot of literature on that. I think one of Richard's World Happiness reports focused on that. And the evidence, I think, is pretty clear that migrants, particularly those coming from less happy countries, tend to get happier, but they don't get as happy as the average citizen of the place where they're going. And that conclusion, in some sense, mirrors what happens to their economic fortunes, where they're economically better off than where they came from, but probably not as well off on average as the average local. So what I'm going to do is to sort of try and talk about the impact of migration on the well-being of the locals, so the non-migrants. I'm going to talk a bit about, is there an impact? If so, why is there an impact? And then what, if anything, should be done about it? And I think there's a sort of danger. A lot of discussion of immigration gets very, very binary. People say, well, I'm pro-immigration or anti-immigration in a way that isn't really terribly helpful, because migrants are very, very heterogeneous. And so although sort of shorthand summary of positions, we all sort of just take shortcuts, it's sort of quite tempting to do that, sometimes unavoidable, but it's often really not very helpful. And so you've got to always remember that migrants are very heterogeneous. So start with something that we sort of do know, which is that there are times when immigration comes to be seen as a major political issue. So this is the fraction of people in the UK who see immigration as the most important issue facing Britain. Over time, we have a series on this back now almost 50 years. And kind of what you notice is that, well, it's sort of gone up and that it was sort of went up and down again. Immediately before the Brexit referendum, we had something like 45% of the British population saying it was the most important issue facing Britain at the time. That has now gone down to under 5%. Of course, because this is the most important issue question, it tends to get crowded out by other things. So you get a dip sort of down after the financial crisis when people said the economy. Then you get a dip down when you've got Brexit, because Brexit shoots up. And at the moment, obviously, COVID is the most important issue. But even though that sort of figure that we've got at the moment is sort of perhaps artificially low, I don't think we're going to go back up anywhere close to the levels that we saw sort of five or so years ago. And that's the UK. This is what we sort of see in the EU, similar kind of question, although people are allowed to list two issues. And you can see the fraction of the population in Eurobarometer. This is saying that immigration is one of the two most important issues facing their country. Around 2015, 2016, this is the period of the sort of big asylum seeking flows coming across the Med, reached 30% of the population. Respondents named immigration at that time. That's gone back down, but it still remains kind of high by historical standards. And although the UK traditionally was a country with a high level of concern about immigration, it's now below average in the European context. So we know that immigration can become a political issue. And I think we know that it begins to influence things like every single, this is maybe something of a caricature, but I think it's not inaccurate to say that every single populist party in Europe, immigration is a central part of their political platform. And although there are one or two exceptions now, pretty much every European country has one of those populist political parties. Again, their support goes up and down. So when, but obviously you can also see from those previous graphs that immigration isn't always regarded as being an issue. And so you might ask, well, can we pick out any features that tend to make it an issue or not? And my view is that when it tends to become a political issue is when there's a perception, rightly or wrongly, that immigration is out of control, that there's no ability to control either the numbers or the mix of migration. And that fits the pattern of getting worried about the asylum flows into the EU in 2015. It explains the UK attitude to free movement post 2004. It explains all the sort of issues in the US around the US-Mexico border. People get worried, concerned when they feel, I don't know where this is going. I don't know quite how this is going to be resolved. So I think it's very clear that immigration can have important political impacts, but I think it's much less clear that that strength of feeling and political influence actually has any impacts on anybody's well-being. So if we sort of think about, is there an impact on well-being? Well, immigration may or may not affect lots of things. So, there's a huge, literature on the impacts of immigration on wages, unemployment, prices, productivity, innovation, the public finances, services, crime, all of, just a huge range of things. And obviously any impact on any of those outcomes may have an indirect impact on well-being. If it affects unemployment, and we know that unemployment affects people's well-being, then that would be a consequence of immigration. But I'm not going to talk today about the impacts on any of those things. You can ask me questions if you want. I'm just going to focus really on studies that basically put a measure of well-being on the left-hand side of a regression and some variable related to immigration on the right, and then it looks at the sign on that coefficient basically. Now, in that kind of regression, even if you do find an impact, how you interpret it may well depend on what other controls you have in that, that regression. So, for example, if you control for whether people are employed or unemployed or their level of household income, then probably you're controlling for any impacts on the labour market impacts of immigration through those variables. If you control for fear of crime or something, or level of crime in your neighbourhood, you'd be controlling for any possible impact of immigration on crime. So, again, it's not quite clear, even if you found an impact in these kind of studies, it's more than a little mysterious about what exactly is the channel, the transmission mechanism that people have in mind there. Okay, so I want to first of all just talk about what is the problem of identifying the impact of immigration on well-being. And I don't think that any of these problems are particularly unique to looking at the impacts on well-being. They actually apply to pretty much looking at the impact of immigration on any other outcome at all. But some of them might be a bit more relevant here for well-being than for some other outcomes. So, for example, you might say, well, if there's an impact of immigration on well-being, what's the right level at which we think that operates? Does that operate at the national level? Is it as your local authority level? Or is it down to your neighborhood level? If you're talking about people's quality of life in their neighbor, how much they like their neighborhood, it might be that what their neighbors are like is what is relevant. But if you're talking about labor market impacts, it might be that national level is more relevant. And different studies take different approaches to this, often driven more by what data is available to them than perhaps what they would ideally like to do. So then there's also a question about, what is the right measure of immigration? And I put e.g. level or share there, but I didn't mean to say that. I meant to say the level or the change. So, I mean, there's one narrative which is about that people, one of the issues with immigration is about change. And that, so when there's an increase in immigration, that causes more issues. And then, once it goes to even a high level that people are used to, it becomes much less of an issue. So you might think there's a different possible effects there. You might think that the mix of immigration matters, who the immigrants actually are matters, and I'll show you some evidence later on that people sort of do feel that way. And, you know, a lot of the problems, you know, in estimating the effect is that it's often very difficult to estimate any effect precisely at the aggregate level, at the country level. You have to control for every other factor that's going on in the country. That's sort of really difficult. We generally, if you go down to a very low local level, we've got really very poor statistics on migrant shares, and so that isn't terribly good. You know, so the whole thing, a problem of disentangling the impact of immigration from other unobservable factors, and dealing with the endogeneity of immigration as well. All of this is a sort of a whole range of problems which I think sort of plague not just estimates of the impact on well-being, but other areas as well. So with that in mind, I'll talk about these kind of studies, a few of them. So if we look at the papers about the impacts of immigration on the well-being of locals, there basically isn't a huge literature. It is actually growing quite fast. So I've sort of listed the sort of papers that I know about here. The oldest one, I think, is 2013, so it's not really a very old literature. And then there are quite a few that in the last year or two. Christian very kindly a couple of days ago drew my attention to a whole series of papers that I had no previous awareness of, so I had to go and read those. So thank you very much for that, Christian. So those series of papers, there's some that sort of look at, you know, across country, across European countries. Some look within individual countries. There's studies for Germany, studies for the US, and there's some for the UK. I'm just going to talk really here about the UK ones in a couple of detail, just to give you a flavour of what people find. So this is one paper that was done by Corrado Giulietti. So this was a bit of research that was commissioned when I was on the Migration Advisory Committee. So basically he's got sort of life satisfaction on the left-hand side. He's got a whole load of controls on the right-hand side. And then he's putting in the immigrant share of the population. And he's estimating models which, you know, put in the immigrant share at the local authority level, and then other ones that put the immigrant share at the local level, so the neighbourhood level, essentially. So lower super output area. At the local authority level, he finds sort of significant positive effects. He then, you know, tries to do something about the endogeneity of immigration, you know, and he finds the effect is even more positive if you do that. But once you kind of get to local, you know, neighborhood level, you find that basically, you know, nothing is significantly different from from zero. And, you know, the advantage, this is using sort of BHPS and UK HLS, so you can put in fixed effects, individual fixed effects in here as well. So the difference between the OLS and the fixed effects, the coefficient always goes down, which sort of suggests that people who are inclined to be happier are more attracted to areas which tend to have higher shares of migrants. Now, that's the sort of overall kind of average effect, but they also kind of look at whether attitudes to the impact of immigration vary by characteristics of the individual. Because we know that immigration, people are very polarized in their views on immigration. And it wouldn't be that surprising, given that if the impact of immigration on their well-being was different. So he does this in sort of a couple of you know, different ways. So just if I talk about this top panel here, he's basically dividing areas up according to the level of the leave vote, which, you know, you are using the argument probably has some element of truth, that concerns about immigration were part of the motivation behind that. He finds that in areas where the leave vote was less than 50%, you know, there's a positive effect you know, immigration on subjective well-being, but once you go to areas with a leave vote more than 65%, it becomes negative, but not significantly, you know, different from zero. So there's perhaps a little bit of evidence there that people's attitudes to immigration, you know, mediates the way in which the level of immigration affects you know, subjective well-being. So that's sort of, you know, and some of those kind of things, you know, you know, there's some numbers down here which begin to get very large. So if you go down to something like the final bottom right-hand panel, you actually get a quite very large negative, marginally significant negative effect in the leave areas of immigration on subjective well-being. But what I hope you can see from this is that all the estimated effects are really quite, you know, they're not terribly significant, they're not terribly robust to specification. It's all a little bit hard to come out from this with feeling enormously confident in the conclusions. I always wince when people say, well, research has shown that, as if, you know, it's established something beyond any possible reasonable doubt. And although if people say that about my research, I guess I'm sort of flattered, I also sort of know not really to believe it too much as well. So it's, you know, it's all quite difficult. Here's another effect. So this is from a paper by Peter Howley and co-authors. So this one on the left-hand side has the GHQ score. I think you all probably know better than me what that is, rather than the life satisfaction question. You know, they tend to get here, you know, and this is looking across local authorities, I think, and negative effects of immigration on average on general GHQ scores. There are a lot of things that you could perhaps criticize about this. For example, it doesn't have area fixed effects. He attempts to control for the social deprivation of the area directly. But, you know, there may be, again, this problem of, well, you know, areas with lots of immigrants may be different in lots of other dimensions you're not controlling for. He does worry about that a bit, but you might be worried he doesn't do it enough. And again, this paper also finds, you know, this sort of pattern that in the Giulietti paper, that if you look at heterogeneities in impacts across groups, that it sort of lines up a little bit with the groups that we think are generally more hostile to immigration, so that you get more negative effects for older people, you get more negative effects for lower income households, more negative effects for the lower educated, more negative effects for the unemployed. And also, you know, he finds that he also distinguishes between the locals, called the natives, the negative effect, but the migrants themselves are made better off by more migrants in their native. So these, you know, that kind of thing. So again, that's sort of got this sort of pattern of, you know, perhaps the consequences of immigration depend upon, you know, what people feel about immigration. But I think I wouldn't really want to say, you know, in some sense, that's quite a nice narrative. I feel a little bit that when you get that result in a specification, you say, well, I'll have that one. And, you know, it may be, I'm not entirely sure it's quite so, so robust. So that's all about the impact on, of immigration per se, but there's also another literature that is very relevant, is a somewhat larger literature on the impact of ethnic and racial diversity and the ethnic composition of areas. Now, ethnic minorities overlap with, but are distinct from migrants. So, and in fact, in the UK, increasingly, these are not, you know, the overlap is becoming less and less. A lot of migrants over the last 20 years have been white, and increasingly a lot of ethnic minorities are British born. So the gap between, the overlap between minority and migrants is becoming weaker and weaker. And, you know, there's some areas where certainly behavior and attitudes, you know, there's quite strong evidence that people seem to have feelings about the ethnic or racial makeup of their local areas. So perhaps the clearest example of that would be the literature on white flight in the US, about how if the fraction of the population in the local area which is black goes up above a certain threshold, that causes the neighborhood to, white people to leave that neighborhood. And then it becomes quite rapidly, it becomes tips into, a majority minority kind of neighborhood. And, the work that Christian referred to at the start with Monica, not Monical, sorry, Monica, found that looked at the effect of the sort of the share, minority share on how satisfied people are with their neighborhood. So not directly life satisfaction, but how much you like your neighborhood. And we did find fairly consistently that people were less happy with their neighborhood. I mean, the respondents here are most overwhelmingly white. There aren't that many minority respondents. So you should perhaps think of that as being the white respondents on generally reported lower levels of satisfaction with their neighborhood when the share of minorities was higher. But when we included immigration separately, which wasn't our main focus of interest, then again, I think that we didn't really find any effect, or it was even positive and so on, but we didn't really put a lot of effort into looking at that. And as I'll show you later, I mean, I think one thing it's important to bear in mind, which I find a little bit surprising, although people complaining about the way in which the country is changing, actually the fraction of the people who say that they're satisfied with their neighborhood, like their neighborhood, is now higher than it's ever been in recorded history. So again, this is one of the many sort of perverse sort of features that everyone thinks, says things are the worst they've ever been, but when you look at the data, it's actually not quite like that. And again, but this literature, although it's much bigger, does have, again, very sort of mixed results, and things that often can't be quite confident. So for example, there's a famous paper by Robert Putnam in the US finding that if areas became more diverse, that eroded trust. But people who've tried to replicate that for the UK have really found that doesn't really seem to be in the case in the UK, at least once you control for sort of socioeconomic deprivation, socioeconomic aspects of the neighborhood. But I think this literature is much larger and sort of much better established, but is not really directly about migrants, is only indirectly about migrants. Okay, so just to kind of, just to summarize those sort of empirical findings, it's hard to find much evidence of harm from immigration on subjective well-being, but it's also hard to find very much evidence of benefit either. It's just, everything's insignificantly different from zero. Perhaps some evidence that impact varies with the attitude to immigration. But this sort of conclusion, as I think, is, quite similar to the research on the impact of immigration in many other areas. Even after putting in a lot of effort, you're left coming away not necessarily much wiser than you were when you went in. But obviously that there is something of a puzzle there, because we know that people do feel strongly about immigration from time to time, and that has quite a big influence on politics. So if that's very direct and easy to see, why is it that it's so hard to find something on, say, subjective well-being? And there are a number of possibilities. One is that actually politics isn't that important to most people in determining their life satisfaction. So you can feel very strongly about in a negative or positive way about something's happening politically, but it doesn't really affect your satisfaction with your life. Most people just aren't that interested. It's also possible that, as I've said already, the evidence base is just really quite weak for a whole series of reasons, and so we just don't learn that much. But I think there are also sort of issues that are around about kind of misinformation and prejudice that I want to talk about. And I think, suppose that we haven't shown this, but so this is a bit hypothetical. But if immigration did reduce the well-being of locals, then would be the question, well, what should you do about it? And normally in this literature, if you think that if X harms well-being, we seek to reduce X. You know, if mental health makes people miserable, then we seek to improve mental health. If unemployment makes people miserable, we seek to reduce unemployment. But with immigration, that kind of just simple approach raises some quite awkward issues. If someone says, well, I don't like immigrants, and you say it affects my well-being, do you say, oh, well, that means we reduce immigration or not? And I think some of the awkward issues here surround the fact that, you know, there's quite a lot of misinformation about things out there and how you deal with that. There's also some of the concerns about immigration I think are best thought of as an anxiety that may not be actually well-founded, but, you know, people are anxious about what is happening and what's going on. And then there's part of attitudes to immigration that are driven by prejudice. And, you know, I think this is all quite difficult. So, I mean, one way I think of seeing these issues is that the subjective wellbeing literature tends to be sort of what I think Sen called a welfarist approach to well-being and so on. And there's no greater insult in the Sen lexicon than to be called a welfarist. You know, and some of the reasons Sen gives for why you shouldn't just focus on, you know, something like subjective well-being is because people's well-being can embody, you know, be influenced by things that we think are just in some sense not terribly legitimate. So I'll talk a little bit about all of these things. So first of all, I would talk about misinformation. So there's lots of it regarding immigration. So this is just you know, illustrates that point. So this is, people are asked the question, what do you think is, what percentage of the population in your country do you think is foreign born? And then that's compared with the actual percent. And, you know, what basically you can see here is that well, I think in every country, but in some countries more than others, the perceived size of the migrant population is a lot bigger. It is bigger than the official statistics say. So, for example, in the UK, when this was done, I can't remember when this was some years ago, you know, people say 25%, and the official statistics at the time were 12.5%. Now, it should be said, some people look at this and say, well, everybody is wrong and the official statistics are right. The British statistics have been continually being revised upwards at the moment. So, you know, and I think it's quite obvious that the gap, I don't think the gap would ever be closed, but people are not actually as wrong as I think they were once thought to be. So, I mean, I think perhaps the best example of that, there's probably this group you've heard of called the 3 million, which represents the interests of of EU citizens in the UK post-Brexit. They're called the 3 million because the official statistics were that there were 3 million EU citizens in the UK. As there have now been 5.4 million applications to the EU settlement scheme, that suggests that the 3 million was not a great name. It should have been the 5.4 million and rising probably. So, you know, the official statistics in the UK have increasingly been shown to have been really quite out. But having said that, I still think people are misinformed about that. So they might say, I'm terribly worried about immigration because it's so high, and it's not as high as they think. So obviously you might think, well, let's just try and correct that. Our approach to that is just try and we inform people. We go out and patiently explain to them. But the problem is that actually many of these beliefs actually seem very hard to move. So there was a survey of 2013 in the Royal Statistical Society did, which actually showed that people were wrong about lots of things. If you ask people what fraction of the population is aged over 65, they have no idea either. I mean, it's not just immigration, it's just, it's lots and lots of things. But on the immigration question, when people gave more than the answer, more than, you know, 30, I think more than double the official number, so something like when they said more than 25%, those people were given a follow-up question, which was something like, well, the official number is 13%. You know, what do you think about that? Hardly any of them said, oh, I'm going to change my mind. Oh, I'm wrong. I've got to change my mind. Most of them say, well, I don't believe the official figures for one reason or another. You know, so saying, oh, we're just going to change people's beliefs to make them better informed is not really quite as easy about you know, as might be thought. And it's also, I think that some of those very high numbers actually don't reflect people's best guess of the migrant share of the population. So there's a sort of misdiagnosis of the problem. I was looking at one data set, and there were a handful of people, when asked what fraction of the UK population is foreign born, said 100%. Now, I find it a little bit hard to imagine that actually those people really thought it was 100%. I think they really just wanted to convey the impression that they felt very strongly about the issue, and instead of giving an unbiased estimate, gave a number which was big and conveyed the strength of their feeling about it. So that may be kind of one issue. I think another issue I wanted to talk about is sort of anxiety. You know, so a lot of people, you know, how do we deal with things? People feel anxious about the impacts of immigration or what's going to happen. We know that anxiety can affect people's subjective well-being. And, you know, but, you know, what's the right way to do about that? Again, you might have a very sort of approach, say, well, the problem, we try and make people less anxious. You know, if there's that anxiety hasn't really got any foundation, we try and deal with all of that. But I think one of the problems with immigration is that I think some of the concern about immigration among some groups seems to really relate to fears about loss of control over, you know, what's going to happen. And I do think that, you know, simply dismissing all of that isn't quite accurate. So, for example, I just put some, you know, stats up here. So, you know, the share of the UK adult population, which is UK born, white and not very well educated, that was 68% of the adult population in 1979. So that was a clear political majority. It's now 31% in 2019. Now, most of that change is from the rise in education, but some of it is from the growth of minorities as a share of the population, some of migration. So if that group says, well, I'm worried about losing control over the country, you don't have to be that, you know, to think, well, actually, if you go from 68% of the population to 31%, you probably are losing influence over what the country does. And similarly in the US, you know, over a slightly longer period, slightly different, similar but slightly different definitions, you know, that's, you know, similar group gone from 74% of the adult population in 1950 to 25% now. And so a lot of this anxiety that you get about in white, not very educated, you know, Americans is really about, you know, they can see the demographic, the way the demographics are going, and it's not people like them. Of course, there's an issue that they perhaps shouldn't feel that even though those people don't seem like them, they may actually be more like them than they think. And then I'll kind of also talk about prejudice. You know, so the problem here is, you know, what do we do about prejudice? If someone says, well, I just don't like foreigners, and having them around really has a negative effect on my well-being, do we go, oh, well, that's fine. Yeah, we'll take account of that. Or do we say, well, no, you're not allowed, you know, other bits of your well-being we're going to pay attention to, but that bit we're going to ignore. And you know, we've got very clear evidence that prejudice continues to influence, you know, attitudes to immigration. Those who admit to being prejudiced have, you know, much more negative attitudes to immigration. I'll just show a couple of studies on this in different countries. This is a study from Switzerland. So I'll just try and explain this. So this is no longer true, but there was a period in which in some Swiss municipalities, if you wanted to be naturalized, i.e. become Swiss, the local municipality voted on it and you had to get a majority. So basically you had to campaign to be naturalized. So you would have your election leaflet and you'd go out and then you'd be voted on. And, you know, what this paper did was that it regressed who's more likely to be naturalized on a whole, you know, series of characteristics that are, in the election information. So people would obviously write how much they contribute to the community and so on and so forth. And what they have on the vertical axis here is just that one of the factors that affected whether you were going to succeed in this vote was whether you were of Yugoslav or Turkish origin. And if you were less likely, other things equal, to be naturalized. You know, conditional on your education, your job, everything else. And this, you know, they estimate this penalty for being Yugoslav or Turkish in every municipality. I have no idea where these places are in Switzerland. And on the right, on the horizontal axis, they plot that against the vote share again on some referendum, anti-immigration referendum in Switzerland, which was, they've had quite a few. And you can see that it's fairly clear that, you know, areas that vote negatively on immigration are more, you know, appear more discriminatory when it came to considering these naturalization things. And another kind of evidence that you can see on that this sort of all matters is that this comes actually similar authors who've got some kind of interesting research on this. So what they did here is they presented people with sort of vignettes of asylum seekers and asked people, would you accept this person as a refugee in your country or not? Would you recommend reject? So they're sort of artificial constructs, and then they randomly vary the contents of things. And you can sort of see here that, you know, people feel quite strongly hostile, you know, they feel more hostile to, they don't feel so strongly actually about where the migrants come from, but they feel, you know, more strongly about people who are these are all asylum seekers, but who sort of give a reason that they're implies they're economic migrants, that have inconsistencies in their stories, more negative against Muslims who don't speak the language, and so on and so forth. So it's clear that all of these attitudes are part of how people think about immigration. But I think one problem is that it's not entirely clear that you can dismiss every concern about immigration as prejudice. And it's a very difficult area to get into to try and say about this. And I'll try and kind of give an example about this. So, so this is actually from the US, but I think other countries have similar kind of things. So this is people saying, it bothers me when I come into contact with immigrants who speak little or no English. And you can see that all Americans split 50-50, yes, no on that. Probably not surprised to learn there was a partisan political split in responses to that question, and so on. But it's obviously half of Americans feel that way. And one approach you might take to that is say, well, that's none of your business. Whatever, you know, they speak in whatever language they want. That's entirely up to them, and that's not a legitimate concern that you have, that you're allowed to have. But on the other hand, you might say somebody comes along and says, well, you know, I used to enjoy talking to my neighbours. You know, that was part of what was the quality of my life, why I enjoyed my neighbourhood. But now they don't speak English and I can't talk to them anymore. And then, well, is that suddenly a legitimate negative impact on somebody's subjective well-being? And then I think it becomes, well, I don't know about that. It's perhaps not quite so simple. And I think immigration, you know, almost inevitably means that some communities change and they have to live somewhere. And often those people, the people living there, you know, often have very little control over those changes. And again, the feeling of loss of control is one of the things that I think people get anxious about with immigration. And, you know, I think that, you know, and those changes, you know, not always necessarily for the better for everyone. So when I was on the MAC, I talked to you got to talk to quite a lot of people about immigration. And I often thought there were two sort of groups of people, really. I'm going to caricature both groups here. So one of them is, you know, talk about change as basically offering, you know, more opportunities and experiences and enriching your life. So this would be the sort of person, and nobody actually told me this, says, well, you know, my neighborhood has been changing. Now this old boring English store has changed to some fancy grocery store, and I can buy pomegranate molasses much cheaper than in Waitrose, and I can now cook all these ottolenghi recipes, and my life is much better as a result. And on the other hand, there were another group of people who basically said, well, I used to buy things from the shop that was there before, and now it's gone, so I can't. And I don't want to eat pomegranate molasses. And, you know, so my world has got worse because of this. This change has sort of threatened my way of life. And it's sort of, people seem to divide quite a lot into, you know, these groups that saw the change as an opportunity and those who saw it as a threat. And I think it's not always necessarily so easy to say that one of those groups is right and the other groups aren't. Okay, before I get too pessimistic, I'll nearly stop at this point. I did say that, you know, things, this is what I mentioned earlier, the percentage of people reporting they like their neighbourhood, I was always a bit surprised by this, is higher now than it ever was. So this whole thing that everything's kind of getting worse, again, doesn't really fill up in the data. Just very quickly to finish up, you know, what does all this mean for immigration policy? Well, I think there's sort of clear increases in subjective well-being for the migrants themselves. So you mustn't lose track of that. The impact on the locals is much less clear, much less clear. And I think one of the central challenges in sort of immigration policy is whether you sort of allow immigration unless there's clear evidence of harm to locals, which you might say we don't have really. Or do you forbid immigration unless there is clear evidence of benefit? And we don't really have that evidence very much either. And so you get a very different immigration policy depending upon which of those two approaches you take. And the way domestic politics is, you probably end up something closer to the second, because it's quite likely that people are not going, if somebody for political party campaigns on vote for policy X, it makes no difference to you, I suspect that isn't a great political slogan. So the sort of precautionary principle probably means that domestic politics in which locals are the ones with the votes means we end up closer to the second kind of approach. Okay. So yeah, so we don't have great evidence on the impact of immigration on locals. And I think that's probably hard to identify, probably because it's hard to identify what a heterogeneous effect. I do think people want to feel that immigration is under control. And you know, they do have views about what the mix of immigration they would like, but they're sort of more relaxed about what those controls are. But control isn't always really so easy, because there are many more people in the world who would like to migrate to high income countries than locals are comfortable with. So there's always the risk of, you know, in some sense, getting in a situation where people feel that things are a bit out of control. So I think I'll just stop there. That was how long I was meant to talk. Bit of apologies for sort of ramble, really.
But it was a hugely enjoyable ramble. Thank you so much. Very, very interesting. Yeah, are there any questions? Well, I maybe started myself. So I like the idea about, you know, that sort of every variable that changes by immigration will affect well-being. So I thought that, you know, maybe the well-being effects are stronger, especially in those areas where we have little adaptation. So I imagine that, you know, in instances where immigration is sort of causing, you know, fear of crime, for example, that might be a particular problem, or like a disturbed sense of belonging. I think these are probably the areas where I would imagine well-being impacts to be stronger or strongest.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very, I think that's sort of plausible, really. You know, and I think, I mean, also relevant is people's ability to, you know, sort of change neighborhoods. So if, for example, this is about the way in which your neighborhood is changing, and, you know, you're sort of well educated, or you rent privately, or you know, your own house, you can move if you feel uncomfortable the way things are going. Whereas if, for example, many and older people as well are more stuck, we know they're much less likely to move. And, you know, those groups may well feel more exposed if, you know, change is going to happen, may be happening to their neighborhood. They don't really have very much control over that, the way that change is happening. And they can't really do anything to get away from any changes that they don't like. And that probably is a recipe for when things, you know, there might be trouble. I don't think you should think of immigration changing communities as the only way in which communities change that necessarily has that effect. Obviously, gentrification and things like that can have, you know, some people feel kind of strongly about that. But immigration is probably one of the ways in which communities have changed the most over the last 15, 20 years.
Lucinda?
Thank you. Yeah, interesting. I was just thinking about, and it partly follows up from what you said, the extent to which we think of neighbourhoods as being the place where people are exposed to immigrants. And clearly the amount of time that people spend in the neighbourhoods where they live is depends a lot on the circumstances. So these effects of older people is not necessarily that they're just sort of more socially conservative or they're less likely to move, presumably, but they're also, they experience that change in the neighbourhood, whereas other people are going to be exposed to immigration, work, on travel to work. You know, that's where that you see change is in the other context in which you spend your life. So I wondered whether there's a certain extent to which we've got a mismatch between what we're trying to measure, which is sort of the change or the exposure to immigrants or the sense that they're around, and measuring that at local authority or LSOA for people for whom that is not the only context in which they're experiencing it. That's just a thought.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's sort of very plausible, because obviously, you know, work is a very important, you know, I mean, quite a high fraction of social interactions outside your immediate household are at work. And, you know, people's experience at work is very different. And again, I think you get this, I mean, again, this was something when I was on the Mac. I mean, you know, I know that if I go for a meal in the economics department, I can find myself as the only local sitting on the table very easily. And it doesn't really worry me you know, I don't even think about it, because you sort of know everyone speaks immaculate English, and they all have a common set of interests that they can talk about. But at the same time, you know, when I was on the Mac, I visited workplaces which were essentially nobody spoke English. And if you spent your day working, you know, as a local, working in that environment where neither of the people, you know, on either side, you can't communicate with, that's a rather different experience, I think, from an academic, from, you know, having a meal at high table in a Cambridge college. And in fact, I think, you know, a lot of people would find it, you know, one of the reasons they ended up 100% migrant is that you just wouldn't last very long there, because there's nobody to talk to if you went in as one kind of local. And you could tell that the people who were there, the only fun that they got out of job was chatting and laughing with each other. I mean, because the job itself was utterly miserable. So again, that would be another aspect of, you know, it's how it affects your environment, your social environment has been quite important.
Mm-hmm. Liam, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just a co-author of one of the papers, and I accept your characterization that the effects are small, and I do think there's quite a bit of converging evidence that, to the extent that there are any effects, they are going in the direction of older respondents. And but I actually think the main point I would have is actually one of the most interesting things coming from the literature is how small these effects are. And it just reminds me of various literatures where something that can be very politically salient, or to use Kahneman's great phrase, you know, nothing is as important as you think it is when you're thinking about it, that immigration has that characteristic of being something that actually, compared to unemployment or ill health or any of these things that really drive people's well-being, doesn't show up at all in any sort of very strong way in any way of estimating it. But yet it's something that you can make people very animated about if you frame it in particular ways. And I think maybe there might be policy conclusions around how immigration is framed and how it can be sort of manipulated to create tension, as opposed to it being, you know, something that actually corely impacts on people's well-being. So sorry, that there was a comment, but just to respond to what you had said about the results.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in some sense, I sort of agree with that. I mean, I think, again, that mirrors the literature on the impacts of immigration on a lot of other things. You know, the estimated effects are often quite small, either of harm or benefit, indeed. I mean, they just sort of don't seem to make that much difference. I mean, I do have slight worries that it's quite hard to detect an effect. So we get small effects because we don't really have the right measure on the right-hand side, for all sorts of reasons, like the ones, Lucinda mentioned. And so, when we don't quite have the right measure on the right-hand side, that tends to bias estimated impacts towards zero. But you're right. I mean, I think it's quite, I think the general conclusion that it can have much bigger effects on politics than it seems to on people's well-being. I think I would just, I'd sign up to that.
Daniela?
Sorry, muted. Do you mind?
Oh yeah, you're muted, Daniela.
Okay, I try again. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Thank you, Alan. Very nice and relevant seminar. I have a few questions relating more to measurements, and especially about the definition of natives, and especially into the context what you present, that it is the overlapping is less and less between what is migrant and ethnic racial diversity. And into that perspective, putting together with policy, I was thinking that people who are born from two migrants coming to the country, and they are still living in the community, might bring another kind of opinion, and especially opinion what the foreign-born or native-born from foreign-born have, like you said, attitude against the ethnic group. You present a few, I don't want to name. But to make it short, I would like to know if in this literature what you read was taking in account this aspect about being native but being married with an immigrant, because that it's also important in this kind of analysis. I think I keep it here. Thank you. I don't know if you got my point.
Yeah, no, I think so. No, I mean, I think that it's probably the case that, for example, things are much more complicated than just migrant, local, minority, majority. But as soon as you try to slice things up into, very, very heterogeneous groups, the problem of identifying any effect becomes impossible. So, if you start wanting to control not just for the minority share, but kind of which minorities, not just the migrant share, but where those migrants come from, look at, the individuals, whether they might be British born, but they might have, as you say, they might be married to a migrant, they might be the children of migrants, and that might plausibly make a difference. All of these things, because we struggle to even sort of estimate the first order effects, I think is sort of, it's likely to be the case that it's even harder to successfully estimate all those sort of more subtle kind of interactions, even though I'm sure that they are relevant.
I agree with you. This was the reason I asked the question, especially in the setting that their policy about against segregation, especially in the Scandinavian countries. What I analyzed the data, we see very clear that the correlations are very strong into that perspective. But because of our registered data, when we control more closely, it makes a difference. And to make the inference that the natives, how we define natives, and that it is something which might be very sensitive, especially when become political. I'm not saying something against what you said. I want to only to point out that these issues are very, very complex. And when you have data in the hands, it seems a little bit difficult to not do something more with that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, what I said at the beginning is that I think reducing immigration to just this binary thing, it doesn't, particularly when you want to translate to policy, it doesn't actually help terribly much, because it's not just, immigration policy is not really just about more or less, it's often about the mix as much as the level. And we know that people have quite strong views about what the mix they feel.
Can I make a remark?
Yes, Richard.
Yes.
I mean, obviously, one issue when you're talking about kind of what should be done is what is the role of intellectuals when they are talking about what should be done. And I don't think it's our job to recommend people to do things that are politically popular. It's our job to recommend things which are right in some sort of utilitarian calculus. So the fact that the immigrant well-being goes up a lot is extremely relevant. Equally relevant is what you call prejudice. Now, I think by prejudice, you're not talking about misinformation, that kind of prejudice based on incorrect factual understanding. But the fact that most people get more enjoyment from being with people like themselves. I mean, this is a really basic fact of human nature. And I think, that should be taken into account equally with the well-being of the immigrants. They both matter. But on the second one, I mean, I was always struck by the Putnam findings, which are uncomfortable. And they're not about misinformation. I mean, they are about people's response to being, in the company of people unlike themselves, and therefore withdrawing or committing crime, all these sort of social dysfunctions in mixed areas. So it's very important if that's not replicated in other countries. I mean, I would love if you could send me at least the references on Britain, but what about, is there literature in other countries on that as well?
I think there is. I think there is. But I haven't kept up with it lately. I mean, maybe Lucinda knows more about, kept up with that more. I'm not sure. I can. I mean, I think people struggled, I think, to automatically assume that, what is primarily in the US, black-white relations just translate all to other countries isn't quite right. And so on. But I think that, the problem is that when you say that people prefer to be, around people like themselves, I mean, that in itself is not an exogenously given thing. I mean, what do you think of someone who is like yourself? You pay attention to their skin color, but you don't pay attention to their eye color. I say I really want to be around other blue-eyed people because
it's cultural.
It's cultural. Yeah, and things. But I mean, again, some of that verges into I just don't like other group. Some of it. I mean, I think it's very hard to. Some of that is just pure, prejudice, basically, against other people, which I agree is not. They just, and I'm not quite sure. The question is whether you should be taking, that should count in your utilitarian calculus or not.
Well, it should count. I mean, of course, everything human has to be taken into account. But we can also then set up policies to change the things that can be changed, including some of that. Widen the circle, as Peter Singer put it.
Yeah, but I mean, that would lead to, if you took that seriously, that you're heading towards Trump's Muslim ban, you're heading towards, I mean, because, when people are asked, what sort of migrants do they want, it's fairly clear what sort of migrants they prefer over others.
Well, that then leads, of course, to basic issues of rights. And
Yes,
I think we all think that, you know, there should be there are no natural rights, but there should be rights established in law, including equal treatment of all religions. I mean, that seems to be necessary for civic peace.
But then at that point, you are saying that somebody who says, I don't like Muslims, you're saying that's not legitimate part of their subjective well-being, you know, so that, you know, you've crossed that line into saying everything is valid, into saying, well, except for this. And then it's about, the difficulty seems to me to quite sort of navigating the line between what is and what isn't acceptable. I don't know, that's the sort of thing that I struggle with, but I agree with what you said, that it's very clear that, you know, immigration is good for the migrants in kind of lots of ways, and that then should be a presumption towards being, you know, more open, but quite how open, I think, is, you know, again, how far should that go? I mean, you know, you'd be talking about, you know, obviously 10% of the world's population say they would like to migrate permanently to another country. So, you know, I mean, that's rather more than one might think was feasible into, you know.
No, I mean, one should take into account all consequences, including political consequences. I'm just saying that you don't think about political views as if they should be decisive. They are just one of the consequences of what you would propose. And if you think that it's going to lead to civil conflict, then of course that's relevant.
Yeah. Yeah. But at that point, yeah, again, I think you're sort of quite close to saying, well, it shouldn't, you know, the politics of it shouldn't affect. I mean, yes, I mean, this is about the debate really, which comes up about, you know, we're designing policy in the world as it is, rather than as the world as we would like it to be.
Sure.
You know, and you know, you're talking about trying to make marginal improvements given certain constraints, which might be movable in the long run, but are pretty immovable in the short run.
Okay, I think it's a fantastic discussion and really, really interesting. Thank you so much. If there are no further questions, I will close it here. Okay. Katja, did you? Oh no, this was a clapping. Okay, thank you very much, Alan, for coming along.
Well,
next week, we also have a Wellbeing seminar, and actually I will be presenting together with Katja and Reto, hopefully, if they can make it. And this will be more about sort of the individual decision to move, and we'll be looking at education, how that relates to moving, and also on mispredicting welfare consequences of moving to the wrong place, and how we can explain some of the stylized well-being differences across space with that. So I hope to see many of you next week, and I wish you all a good day. Bye.